At first, the world did not hear this story through a medical report, a palace announcement, or a royal ceremony. It arrived quietly, carried by a simple admission of human truth. Moments of fear, moments of exhaustion, words that could belong to anyone facing illness, uncertainty, or loss. Yet this time, they came from a woman the world had long associated with calm, composure, and stability. Catherine, Princess of Wales, known globally as Catherine. For more than a decade, she had been one of the most recognizable figures on the planet, a symbol of modern royalty. Elegant, disciplined, seemingly untouched by chaos. Her public image was carefully consistent, built on appearances that reassured rather than disrupted. In a world hungry for scandal, she represented continuity, reliability, quiet strength. And then, almost without warning, she disappeared. In early 2024, Catherine stepped away from public life. No engagements, no photographs, no official explanations beyond a brief statement referencing a planned medical procedure. In the age of constant visibility, absence itself became news. Speculation filled the silence. Social media theorized. Headlines multiplied. Where was she, and why was no one talking? What few people knew at the time was that behind palace walls, a different reality was unfolding. One that had nothing to do with titles or tradition. One that stripped away status and reduced life to its most basic questions. Survival, family, time. Cancer does not announce itself with respect for rank. It does not pause for protocol. It arrives quietly, often unexpectedly, and when it does, it forces even the most public figures into deeply private battles. Catherine's journey began not with a diagnosis, but with what appeared to be something routine, a planned abdominal surgery, initially described as non-cancerous. A medical event that, under normal circumstances, would never have captured global attention. But medicine has a way of rewriting narratives. Post-operative tests revealed something far more serious: cancer. The word that collapses certainty and redraws the future in an instant. In that moment, Catherine was no longer a princess in the public eye. She was a patient, a mother. A woman confronting a reality millions face every year, often without cameras, often without protection from fear. This documentary is not about royal duty or palace tradition. It is about what happens when a global icon is forced into the same vulnerability as everyone else. When strength is no longer performative, but internal. When silence becomes a form of survival. And when recovery is not a triumphant ending, but a long, unfinished process. As we mark World Cancer Day in 2026, nearly 2 years after her diagnosis and 1 year after she publicly confirmed her remission, Catherine chose to speak again. Not from a balcony, not from a stage, but through a message that acknowledged what many survivors rarely feel permitted to say out loud: that even after treatment ends, fear remains. That exhaustion lingers, that hope is not the absence of pain, but the decision to continue despite it. Her words resonated far beyond the royal family, because they were not royal words, they were human ones. This is the story of that journey, from silence to disclosure, from illness to advocacy, from private suffering to public meaning, and from a woman the world thought it knew to a reality few ever saw. A story not about overcoming cancer as a victory narrative, but about living alongside it, learning from it, and using its shadow to bring light to others. This is the story of Catherine, not as a symbol of royalty, but as a beacon of resilience in a world where illness does not discriminate, and hope often arrives quietly after the hardest nights. Before illness entered the picture, Catherine, Princess of Wales, occupied a rare position in modern public life. She was visible without being controversial, admired without being polarizing. In an era when institutions struggled to retain trust and public figures were constantly scrutinized, Catherine represented something increasingly uncommon: stability. From the moment she married Prince William, her role was defined by restraint. She did not dominate headlines with statements or spectacle. Instead, she appeared consistently, predictably, and with purpose. School visits, early childhood initiatives, mental health advocacy. Her presence was calm, measured, and carefully aligned with long-term causes rather than short-term attention. For many, she became the emotional anchor of a royal family navigating generational transition. The public came to see her as dependable, the woman who would show up, smile, and move on, the mother photographed walking her children to school, the figure standing beside the future king, reinforcing the image of continuity at a time when continuity felt fragile. Over the years, this consistency built something stronger than popularity. It built trust. What made Catherine's image so powerful was not visibility alone, but predictability. She did not overshare. She did not explain herself unnecessarily. Her personal life remained largely protected, not through secrecy, but through discipline. In a media environment that rewards constant disclosure, her restraint became part of her brand, even if it was never described as such. By the start of 2024, she was widely regarded as one of the most successful royal figures of her generation. Polls reflected high approval ratings. International media framed her as the future face of the monarchy. To many observers, she embodied the idea that the royal institution could still feel human, relevant, and emotionally intelligent in the modern world. This is what made her sudden absence so destabilizing. When she withdrew from public duties following her surgery, there was no emotional context to frame it, no long explanation, no gradual transition, simply a disappearance from a role that relied on presence. And because her image had been built on reliability, that absence felt louder than any scandal. In the vacuum, speculation flourished. The same consistency that once protected her now worked against her. The public was unused to not seeing her. News outlets questioned timelines. Social platforms dissected every available detail. Silence, which had once signaled dignity, was suddenly interpreted as secrecy. Yet, from another perspective, this withdrawal was entirely consistent with who Catherine had always been. She had never invited the public into moments she could not control. She had never used vulnerability as currency. And now, faced with something that threatened not just her health, but her family's emotional safety, she chose the same approach she always had: privacy, boundaries, time. What the world perceived as absence was, in reality, containment, a deliberate narrowing of focus. Away from duty, away from expectation, away from the version of herself the public had come to rely on. Because before she could be a symbol again, she had to be something far more essential: a patient, a mother, a person navigating uncertainty without an audience. This chapter of her story is often overlooked because it lacks spectacle. There were no dramatic statements, no defining photographs, no visible turning point. But it is precisely this quiet that defines the weight of what followed. Because when a figure built on consistency chooses silence, it is rarely accidental. It is usually necessary. And in that silence, the foundation was laid for a transformation that would later redefine not only how the public saw Catherine, but how she chose to be seen at all. The turning point in Catherine's story did not arrive with warning signs or public concern. It began in a way that felt ordinary, almost procedural. In January of 2024, the palace announced that the Princess of Wales had undergone planned abdominal surgery. The statement emphasized that the condition was not cancerous. There was no sense of alarm, only reassurance. Recovery was expected. Time away from public duties was framed as temporary. For the outside world, this explanation seemed sufficient. Medical procedures happen, people rest, life resumes. But inside hospital walls, reality unfolded differently. As is often the case in medicine, answers came not when doctors expected them, but after the initial intervention was complete. Post-operative testing revealed the presence of cancer. It is difficult to overstate the shock of such a moment. A procedure intended to resolve one issue suddenly opened the door to another far more serious reality. There was no gradual preparation, no extended period of suspicion. Just a single word that redefined everything that came after it: cancer. In that instant, future plans became provisional. Calendars lost meaning. The priorities of a public figure narrowed to the same concerns faced by millions of patients around the world. What does this mean for my body, for my children, for the life I was supposed to return to? What made Catherine's situation uniquely complex was not simply the diagnosis, but the context in which it occurred. She was not only navigating a medical crisis, but doing so under the weight of global attention. Every decision would be scrutinized, every delay questioned, every silence interpreted. Yet at the core of it all was a reality that no amount of privilege could soften. Cancer does not negotiate. At nearly the same moment, another diagnosis shook the royal household. In February of 2024, King Charles III publicly disclosed that he too was undergoing treatment for cancer. The coincidence was stark. Two senior members of the royal family facing the same enemy within weeks of each other. For the monarchy, it was unprecedented. For Catherine, it compounded an already overwhelming situation. Yet unlike the king, whose diagnosis came with formal statements and institutional framing, Catherine's experience remained largely unseen. She was younger, a mother of 3 young children. Her illness carried different implications, not only for the line of succession, but for the emotional stability of a family still early in its public life. At this stage, there were no public speeches, no personal messages, no explanations beyond carefully measured lines. Behind the scenes, decisions were being made that would shape the months to come. How to treat the illness, when to speak, how to protect children from a reality they were too young to fully understand, how to preserve normalcy when nothing felt normal. This was the moment where Catherine's journey diverged from expectation. The public had seen her as composed, prepared, and in control. But cancer does not test composure. It tests endurance. And endurance, unlike performance, happens quietly. The diagnosis did not make her story extraordinary. It made it universal. A reminder that illness does not discriminate by title or status. That even in the most protected environments, the body remains vulnerable. And that the most life-altering chapters often begin not with drama, but with routine procedures that quietly change everything. This was not yet the story of recovery. It was the story of disruption. The moment when a carefully balanced life was forced into pause, and when the path forward became uncertain, undefined, and deeply personal. As weeks turned into months, the absence of Catherine, Princess of Wales, began to take on a life of its own. In the modern media landscape, silence is rarely neutral. It invites interpretation, speculation, and projection. And in Catherine's case, the quiet surrounding her health became louder than any official announcement could have been. The initial palace statement had been brief and reassuring. Recovery would take time. Public duties would resume later in the year. For an institution built on tradition and control of narrative, this was standard procedure. But the world around it had changed. Social media moved faster than official channels. Rumors filled the gaps left by restraint. Every photograph was analyzed, every timeline questioned. What followed was a wave of conjecture that revealed as much about modern information culture as it did about Catherine herself. Online theories ranged from the mundane to the extreme. News outlets debated transparency. Commentators asked whether the public was owed more information. In a digital environment driven by immediacy, patience became scarce. Yet from within the royal household, the decision to remain quiet was not rooted in avoidance. It was rooted in protection. Catherine was not only facing a medical reality, but also the emotional responsibility of guiding her 3 children through it. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis were still young. Shielding them from fear and confusion became a priority that outweighed public curiosity. For Catherine, the question was not how to manage headlines, but how to manage her home. Illness has a way of shrinking the world. Public roles fade into the background as private needs come sharply into focus. And while the monarchy has long balanced public obligation with personal sacrifice, this moment required a different calculus. Health before duty. Family before image. Eventually, silence gave way to a choice. In March of 2024, Catherine addressed the world directly through a recorded video message. Seated calmly, speaking with deliberate care, she explained that post-surgery tests had revealed cancer and that she was undergoing preventative chemotherapy. The message was not dramatic. It was measured, composed, and deeply human. In that video, she articulated the tension she had been living with for weeks, the need to take time to recover, the need to protect her children, and the need to process a diagnosis that had arrived unexpectedly. She did not frame herself as a victim, nor did she offer reassurance beyond what felt honest. Instead, she asked for understanding, for space, for time. The response was immediate and global. Sympathy replaced speculation. Support eclipsed rumor. For many, the video reframed the silence that had come before it. What once seemed like secrecy was now understood as survival. What had appeared distant was revealed to be deliberate care. From a media perspective, this moment marked a shift. Catherine did not surrender control of the narrative. She reclaimed it. By speaking when she was ready, on her own terms, she reset the conversation. The focus moved away from absence and toward reality, away from guessing and toward empathy. This phase of her journey exposed a fundamental truth about public life in the digital age. Visibility is often demanded, but vulnerability cannot be rushed. And in choosing when to speak, rather than being forced to respond, Catherine demonstrated that silence, when used with intention, can be one of the most powerful forms of communication. The storm of speculation did not disappear overnight, but it no longer defined her story. The narrative had shifted from mystery to meaning. And in that shift, the groundwork was laid for a deeper public understanding of what lay ahead. Once the words had been spoken and the diagnosis acknowledged, a different chapter began, one that unfolded almost entirely away from cameras and public expectation. Preventative chemotherapy, a phrase that sounds clinical, even reassuring, but conceals the physical and emotional weight carried by those who endure it. For Catherine, treatment did not happen in isolation. It occurred within the framework of a family still learning how to name fear without letting it take over. The decision to begin chemotherapy was both medical and personal. It was a commitment to long-term survival, but also an acceptance that the months ahead would be difficult, unpredictable, and draining. Chemotherapy alters the body in ways that are rarely visible in official updates. Fatigue that lingers beyond rest, nausea that disrupts routine, a sense of weakness that challenges identity. For someone whose public role had always been built on presence and composure, this loss of physical certainty carried its own emotional cost. During this time, Catherine withdrew almost completely from public view. There were no appearances, no gradual reintroductions, no symbolic gestures of resilience. This absence was not strategic, it was necessary. Treatment demanded energy. Recovery required patience. And above all, her children needed a version of their mother that felt safe and familiar, even as her body underwent change. In her message to the public, Catherine acknowledged how difficult it had been to explain the situation to her children. Finding the right words, choosing honesty without fear, creating stability in a moment defined by uncertainty. These are challenges shared by countless parents facing serious illness, regardless of status or circumstance. The months of treatment stretched on, slow and heavy. 9 months that tested endurance more than resolve. Progress was not measured in milestones or achievements, but in days completed, cycles endured, strength preserved where possible. There was no visible victory, only persistence. Throughout this period, Catherine continued to care deeply about the causes she had long supported: early childhood development, mental health, family well-being. But her advocacy moved behind the scenes. Private conversations replaced public campaigns. Quiet involvement replaced formal engagements. Influence did not disappear, it simply changed form. What makes this chapter essential is not the medical detail, but the restraint with which it was shared. There were no curated images of bravery, no staged moments of treatment. In a culture that often demands performative strength, Catherine offered something different: absence, privacy, and an implicit reminder that healing does not need an audience. This phase of her journey challenges a common narrative around illness, particularly among public figures. The idea that courage must be visible, that resilience must be documented. Catherine's experience suggests otherwise. Sometimes courage is choosing to step away. Resilience is preserving what matters most when everything else is stripped back. As the months passed, the world waited. But inside a much smaller circle, the work was already being done. Not the work of appearances or reassurance, but the work of surviving one day at a time. And in that quiet persistence, the foundation for recovery was slowly being laid. By September of 2024, the most intense phase of treatment had come to an end. Catherine publicly confirmed that she had completed her course of chemotherapy. The announcement was brief and carefully worded, offering neither celebration nor finality. There was no declaration of victory, only an acknowledgement of progress. For many patients, the end of treatment is expected to mark a return to normal life. But Catherine's message challenged that assumption. She spoke openly about how difficult the previous 9 months had been, not just physically but emotionally. The experience had tested her family in ways that could not be neatly summarized or easily left behind. Completion of chemotherapy did not mean completion of the journey. Recovery, she emphasized, would take time. The body needed to rebuild. The mind needed to adjust. And the emotional impact of cancer did not disappear simply because treatment had stopped. This honesty resonated deeply with those who understood that healing is rarely linear. In the months that followed, Catherine remained selective about her public presence. Royal duties were still scaled back. Appearances were limited and purposeful. Each step forward was taken cautiously, guided by medical advice and personal readiness, rather than expectation. This measured return reflected a growing awareness of her own limits, something she had rarely been allowed to acknowledge before. Privately, the focus shifted toward long-term well-being. Staying cancer-free became a priority rather than an assumption. Follow-up appointments, monitoring, and ongoing recovery became part of daily life. The future, while hopeful, was now approached with humility rather than certainty. This period marked a subtle but important transition. Catherine was no longer actively undergoing treatment, but she was not yet restored to the version of herself the public remembered. She occupied an in-between space, one familiar to many survivors. Strong enough to move forward, but changed by what had come before. In choosing to share this phase of her experience, Catherine expanded the conversation around illness. She did not frame recovery as an endpoint, but as a continuation, a process that demands patience and self-compassion, a reminder that survival is not just about enduring treatment, but about learning how to live differently afterward. Her restraint remained consistent. She did not rush back into visibility. She did not offer reassurance beyond what she could honestly give. Instead, she modeled a quieter form of strength, one that recognizes progress without denying vulnerability. This chapter, though less dramatic than diagnosis or treatment, is where many of the deepest changes occurred. The urgency of survival gave way to the discipline of maintenance. And in that shift, Catherine began to redefine what resilience looked like, not as a performance, but as a practice carried forward day by day. The next turning point in Catherine's journey arrived not with fanfare, but with intention. In January of 2025, she made a quiet visit to the Royal Marsden NHS Foundation Trust in London. For the public, it appeared as a surprise engagement. For Catherine, it was a return to the place where vulnerability had once defined her days. It was during this visit that she confirmed she was in remission. The word carried weight, but it was delivered without spectacle. In a statement released afterward, she described the news as a relief, while making clear that recovery remained her focus. Remission was not framed as an ending, but as a moment of cautious gratitude. The choice of location was deeply symbolic. The Royal Marsden is one of the world's leading cancer treatment centers, known not only for medical excellence, but for its commitment to patient-centered care. By returning there, Catherine bridged her private experience with her public role. She did not distance herself from the place that represented her most fragile moments. She honored it. During that visit, she met with staff, patients, and families navigating their own diagnoses. There were no staged speeches, no ceremonial distance. Instead, there was recognition, shared understanding, a sense of connection rooted in experience rather than title. Soon after, it was announced that Catherine, alongside Prince William, would become joint patron of the Royal Marsden. The appointment marked a clear evolution in her public identity. This was no longer advocacy from observation. It was advocacy informed by lived experience. This shift carried significance beyond symbolism. It signaled a deeper alignment between her personal journey and her public mission. Healthcare, once one of many causes, now held personal meaning. Support for cancer research and patient services became an extension of her own story, not an abstract responsibility. What made this transformation compelling was its authenticity. Catherine did not adopt the role of survivor as a brand. She did not center herself as a spokesperson for illness. Instead, she positioned herself as part of a larger community, one voice among many, using visibility to amplify rather than overshadow. In the months that followed, her re-emergence into public life continued gradually. Engagements were chosen carefully. Appearances reflected purpose rather than obligation. Each step reinforced the idea that her return was not about resuming a role unchanged, but about reshaping it. This phase marked the integration of illness into identity, without allowing it to define her entirely. Catherine had moved from patient to patron, from private struggle to public service. Not by erasing what she had endured, but by allowing it to inform how she showed up in the world. In doing so, she offered a model of leadership rooted in empathy, one that acknowledges pain without being consumed by it, and one that transforms personal hardship into collective meaning, quietly and with intention. By the beginning of 2026, 1 year had passed since Catherine publicly confirmed her remission. The milestone was not marked by ceremony or celebration, but by reflection. In a brief message shared on January 14th, she acknowledged the anniversary with characteristic restraint, reiterating that recovery remained ongoing and deeply personal. Her return to public life continued at a measured pace. Early in the year, she appeared alongside Prince William at Charing Cross Hospital, an engagement that quietly reinforced her commitment to healthcare and to those working within it. The visit was understated, yet meaningful. It reflected a growing alignment between her lived experience and her public presence. Around the same time, Catherine offered a rare glimpse into her inner world during an away day in West Wales. Speaking informally with well-wishers, she shared that being in nature had become an important part of her healing. It was, she said, good for her soul. The comment was simple but revealing. It suggested a shift in priorities, an understanding that recovery extends beyond medicine into environment, pace, and connection. She also spoke briefly about her family, mentioning Prince George's growing interest in aviation. The detail was small, almost incidental, yet it carried weight. It was a reminder of how deeply she valued normalcy, of her desire to keep her children grounded in curiosity and routine, even as her own life had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances. Then, on World Cancer Day, Catherine shared a message that would resonate far beyond the United Kingdom. Accompanied by footage from her visit to the Royal Marsden, she addressed those facing cancer directly. Her words were calm, unembellished, and deliberate. She spoke of the importance of hope amid moments of fear and exhaustion, and she ended with a simple reassurance: "You are not alone." What made this message powerful was not its scale, but its tone. It did not instruct, it did not inspire through rhetoric. It acknowledged reality. Fear remains, exhaustion persists, recovery is uneven, yet hope can exist alongside all of it. In this moment, Catherine did not speak as a princess or a patron. She spoke as someone who had lived through diagnosis, treatment, and the long aftermath that follows. Her message reached those newly diagnosed, those in the midst of treatment, and those learning how to live after it. It validated experiences that are often minimized once medical milestones are reached. By choosing social media as her platform, Catherine bypassed traditional channels and addressed the public directly. The message was intimate without being invasive, public without being performative. It reflected an evolving understanding of communication in the digital age, one that prioritizes connection over control. This chapter of her story underscores a quiet truth: that leadership does not always come through authority or visibility. Sometimes it comes through recognition, through saying what others are afraid to admit, through offering presence rather than solutions. As she continued to navigate life after cancer, Catherine's role was no longer defined by what she had endured, but by how she chose to use it. Not to dominate the conversation, but to open space for others within it. And in doing so, she transformed a personal milestone into a collective moment of empathy and understanding. To understand why Catherine's story resonated so deeply around the world, it is necessary to step back from emotion and examine it through the lens of journalism, public relations, and personal branding. Not to diminish its authenticity, but to understand why authenticity, in this case, became so powerful. From a journalistic perspective, this was not a story driven by revelation, scandal, or conflict. It unfolded slowly, across months, sometimes years. Its strength lay in continuity rather than climax. Reporters were not fed constant updates. Instead, they were given carefully timed, minimal information. This forced the media to follow Catherine's lead rather than dictate the narrative. In an era of oversharing, restraint became newsworthy. Crucially, Catherine never attempted to control public emotion. She did not ask for sympathy. She did not dramatize her suffering. When she spoke, she did so plainly, acknowledging fear and exhaustion without amplifying them. This allowed audiences to project their own experiences onto her story. Journalistically, it shifted the frame from celebrity illness to shared human condition. That shift is rare, and it is why the coverage sustained empathy rather than fatigue. From a public relations standpoint, her approach represents a masterclass in long-term reputation management during crisis. There was no reactive messaging, no defensive tone. Silence was used strategically, not to obscure truth, but to delay it until it could be communicated with clarity and care. When the message finally came, it was delivered directly, in her own voice, without intermediaries. The choice to prioritize family and recovery over immediate transparency carried risk. In the short term, it invited speculation. In the long term, it paid trust dividends. Once the full context was revealed, earlier silence was reinterpreted as responsibility rather than avoidance. This retroactive reframing is one of the most difficult outcomes to achieve in crisis communication, and yet it occurred organically. Equally important was what Catherine did not do. She did not monetize her illness. She did not turn recovery into a campaign. She did not allow cancer to become her sole public identity. Instead, she integrated it into an existing narrative of service, care, and emotional intelligence. From a branding perspective, this preserved continuity while allowing for evolution. Catherine's personal brand before illness was built on consistency, discipline, and quiet presence. After illness, those same traits remained, but they were deepened by vulnerability. The brand did not change direction, it gained dimension. She was no longer only a symbol of stability, but a symbol of endurance. Not aspirational perfection, but credible strength. Her decision to align formally with the Royal Marsden as joint patron was also significant. It transformed personal experience into institutional commitment without centering herself as the solution. The focus remained on systems, research, and care. This reinforced credibility and avoided the perception of performative advocacy. Perhaps most notably, Catherine redefined what visibility looks like for a modern public figure. She showed that connection does not require constant exposure, that leadership can exist without domination of attention, and that saying less, when done honestly, can communicate more than any carefully crafted campaign. In branding terms, this is the power of congruence. Her actions matched her words, her silence matched her values, and her return matched her readiness. There were no contradictions to exploit, no overcorrections to explain. The narrative held because it was lived, not managed. Ultimately, Catherine's journey through cancer succeeded as a public story because it was never designed as one. It followed the rhythm of real illness, real recovery, and real uncertainty. Media, audiences, and institutions were asked to slow down and follow rather than consume. In a world saturated with noise, her story reminds us that credibility is built not through constant messaging, but through consistency over time. That empathy is earned through honesty, not performance. And that the most enduring personal brands are not constructed in moments of triumph, but revealed in moments of vulnerability. This is why Catherine emerged from this chapter not diminished, but redefined. Not as a figure above others, but alongside them. And that, more than any title or role, is what turned her private battle into a story of collective meaning.